All right, I think we're going to kick off the session now. A little bit later, but not too much. Welcome to this track. As the man on the ground, or one of the men on the ground for MarkLogic in Minnesota, we're sponsoring this track session. So unfortunately for you, I get to speak for 2 minutes about MarkLogic, and then I'll introduce our first speaker, Donald Jess. So MarkLogic, we have a table out there and a booth, so please come and talk to us at any point during the day. If you're interested in databases and the new generation of databases that are non-relational. So MarkLogic fit fairly and squarely in that NoSQL space. It's a term that 5 years ago wasn't even coined, I don't think. And over the last 1 to 2 or 3 years, NoSQL or non-relational database technologies have become very, very established. Gartner recently put MarkLogic in the top right leadership quadrant for operational data stores. That's not just good for MarkLogic, it's good for non-relational databases and NoSQL in general. It's good for enterprise architects and solution architects who now have a validated additional option to put into your infrastructure for very agile ingest and delivery of data and of content. And the reason why Gartner put us in that top leadership quadrant anyway was the likes of customers such as healthcare.gov, CMS, got a lot of press, not all of it positive, but in the infrastructure there, fundamentally MarkLogic is the central content repository for all that health insurance data from 37 states, and also the data hub, which rationalizes your credentials as citizens with the Department of Homeland Security, Internal Revenue Service, and all other types of data as well. So a very fundamental part of the healthcare.gov architecture. JP Morgan Chase have MarkLogic as the operational data store for all their derivatives trades globally. So another kind of very, very high-scale example of NoSQL database use. So at the end of the day, most of our customers, whether they're in healthcare or retail, financial services, wherever, they're ultimately looking for data consolidation, a single view of whatever it is, customers, patients, digital assets, and operating often in a service-oriented architecture with a data as a service vision or objective underpinning that. And the final comment is a bleeding-edge comment. I'm not sure how many of you out there are looking at linked open data and triple stores, a way of annotating content and data with very, very simple metadata and linking that potentially to open linked data stores as well. But we're also a triple store. And that was a direction which was very much forced on us almost by some of our customers, such as the BBC and three-letter acronym agencies here in the US, who are looking for triple stores that are enterprise grade. So there's this kind of impedance mismatch, if you like, of data, marshalling data between database systems, between lines of business, between companies, and fundamentally a NoSQL database takes care of the schema and the format impedance mismatch that you get between databases. Triple stores take account of that meaning or vocabulary impedance mismatch between databases and lines of business. So we have quite a unique proposition. Again, if you want to talk more about those kinds of technologies and capabilities, please come and see us throughout the day. Now moving on to the proper portion of the session. Our first speaker is Donald Jess. Dr. Donald Jess was an R&D chemist for the first 20 years of his career, the next 10 years as an information systems consultant, and for the last 10 years has been working in IT infrastructure operations at United Healthcare. Dr. Jess is part-time faculty at Capella University. Welcome, Donald.
Thank you, David. United Healthcare is certainly interested now with databases. I'll be out talking to you later. My coworkers call me Dr. Don because my wife of many years has first dibs on the title Dr. Jess. So I'm just Dr. Don. I'd like to be more approachable. I didn't have a title for the abstract I submitted, so they took the first sentence of my abstract. And I don't really have a title for this. It's developed over time, and I'm going to go over the sequence. It's actually 3 presentations. It won't be that long, but I'm going over information systems capabilities for creating sustainable competitive advantages. And then after I worked on that, then I later developed an enterprise architecture business decision model. Once you become, you know it's a competitive advantage, how do you become a decision model? And finally, I'm going to reflect on some enterprise architects as an academic discipline. This research, first 20 years of my career was R&D, in R&D, so I'm research-oriented, academic-oriented. In 2010, I had the opportunity to talk to a business sustainability conference for Argosy University on information systems capability for creating sustainable competitive advantage. This was a business conference on sustainability. When I looked at the program, it turned out it was lean energy, conservation, ecology, human rights, a lot of liberal, let me call them liberal topics that I certainly support, but here I was then talking about a very capitalistic, competitive business. I wanted, should I still go ahead? And they said, yes, it was fine, it was accepted. Then I presented again in 2012 with my methodology, which I will go over briefly. And I also then in 2013 presented it to the Society for the Advancement of Management in Washington, D.C., which is a very business-oriented management, tends to be business faculty in that conference, who really didn't understand IT or technology, which I think everyone knows there's a gap between aligning technology with business. Hopefully this audience will understand a little more. And then I'm going to reflect on as an academic discipline. So first part, we'll start out with Porter's value chain model, which is common. But what I want to highlight here is that information systems, meaning people, process, technology, are in all of these different parts of the organization, from logistics, operations, outbound logistics, marketing, sales. There's information systems in each one, in all of these. How well they talk to each other is an architectural issue, but there are, given a fact, there are in modern business, you can't run it without computers. Generically, for a business strategy to sustain competitive advantage, you're either cost leadership, differentiate, or focused on, you can focus on cost or focus on differential. These are generic for any business model. So how do we apply that to information systems? Competitive advantage relative to information systems, a business strategy is developed prior to information. The business strategy was developed prior to information systems maturity as a strategy. We'll go over a timeline a little later, but information systems, architecture, technology are relatively new to the compared to business. And information systems are critical components to the value chain. Each one of those components has the information systems. Technology and systems are often confused as being one and the same. They are different. Information systems are people, process, technology. Technology is a commodity, hardware, software. And information systems competitive advantage involves capabilities and assets. Capabilities, do you have the people that can execute, and assets, do you have the physical assets, the data centers? Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon developed the capability maturity model, and originally and follow on from that was a people capability maturity model for how you develop your staff. So the people component of systems are one of the key components to the capabilities. Do you have staff that execute well? Briefly, I'm going to go over the history of information systems, different between IS and IT, creating barriers to erosion of competitive advantage. That's somewhat an awkward sentence, but that's how the academics describe creating a sustainable competitive advantage. You put barriers to eroding your competitive advantage. And then sustainable competitive advantage is developing core competencies in information systems and sourcing IT assets. Information systems started in the 1960s with the advent of computers. First noticed in the 70s was management information systems. Into the 1980s, started developing strategic information systems. In the 1990s, information system strategic planning, where you're actually planning your IS strategies. This is important. I try to be an evangelist, calling it information systems and not IT, but I've somewhat lost that battle. Everyone calls it IT for information technology, which is hardware, software. There's little generic and generally little difference between vendors. I'm talking about like a PC vendor or a word processing vendor. Decreasing cost because of Moore's law. Your computers are getting faster every 18 months. It's a commodity. And I mentioned IT. Does IT matter? Nicholas Carr, it's 10 years old, but I don't think people really understand that. What Carr was talking about, if I can get to my notes. You had to read his book very carefully. And in the preface to it, on page 12, he explains, throughout this book I use the term information technology, IT, as the term is most widely used in the United States. In other areas of the world, it's commonly a more precise term, information and computer technology, or ICT, have come into favor. As commonly used, I believe IT and ITC are interchangeable. I use IT with that understanding. Nicholas Carr was a former editor of the Harvard Business Review. He very much represents the business community's view of IT. He thinks he's projecting the opinion that the business world believes IT is hardware and software. And that is what he's talking about. And I don't have any disagreement with hardware and software are generic commodities, but he's always talking about that. He's not talking about the information systems part, the people and process. So his book is correct, but people misinterpret it that he's saying you don't need information systems, people, process, technology, proprietary systems, differentiate in competitiveness and assets, and meaning making of the firm's value chain. How do you actually add value? So that's one of my important takeaways, that business does not really understand the full concept of information systems, and they may just interpret it as a commodity of hardware and software. The literature describes competitive advantage in terms to creating barriers to erosion of competitive advantage. The barriers are created information systems capability and information systems assets. I'll use the example of logistical companies like FedEx or UPS. It's very difficult to duplicate their assets they have for logistics and delivering their product. Another example of capabilities with Intel in making the computer chips. It's very difficult to duplicate those staff with the capabilities to develop increasingly high-performance computer chips. Information system sustainable competitive advantage. For capabilities is the technical skills that are developed throughout organizational learning. I mentioned the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute people capability model for developing people. It's a very good framework. Management skills. All organization needs good managers, and managers don't just come to an organization. They need to work in the organization a long time, which is capabilities that are not, you cannot buy, you have to develop those. And relationships, again, something that it develops over time. And assets are infrastructure built up as assets accumulate and mature over time. Data centers. I worked for United Healthcare for the last 12 years, and one of the things that United Healthcare has done to develop as assets is 2 data centers. Actually develop the data centers within the organization. And information repositories that are developed and mature over time. Again, this is from the literatures. Surveys were done to find out what IS capabilities should be kept in-house. I'll go through the sourcing decision where you have it in-house or external, but what any organization needs to keep in-house is leadership, informed buying, making technology work, relationship building, contract facilitation, architecture planning, business system thinking, vendor development, and contract monitoring. It doesn't matter if it's internal or outsourced. You need to keep the leadership, relationships, and vendor management within house. It's pretty well common sense. Information assets, I call onshore outsourcing or in-house sourcing. The assets, meaning the hardware, the data centers, if they're going to be outsourced, you will generally outsource them to a vendor to take over your data center, have the IT people change your badge, or you develop those skills within house. Infrastructure sourcing is almost always done onshore, meaning the computers, the physical latency to go to a computer across the country, even from Minneapolis to the East Coast, is 35 milliseconds. It's hard to duplicate or to replicate databases over that distance. Usually it's something like within the metropolitan area, like 30 miles is probably the maximum based on the physical laws of how fast you can transfer data. So they're almost always done onshore for the infrastructure sourcing. The business should, with sufficient critical mass, meaning it's large enough, generally should have insourcing, because if you go to an outsourcing organization, they generally need to charge a markup. Something I just added, the first part of this actually is from the literature, but I certainly added the last bullet point. In recent years, it's the increased concern about security. I believe direct control of a system's security is important to have it insourced within your own company. Assets, not a information system infrastructure, not a core competency, but can be used for a strategic advantage. And information repositories are the data process methods for decision making and meaning making. In conclusion, business sustainable competitive advantage strategy by default includes information systems. Information systems capabilities and assets are strategies for sustaining a competitive advantage in business. And businesses should focus on information systems core capabilities and develop those capabilities internally if the business is critical mass, a large enough company to do that. So the first part, developing the sustainable competitive advantage. Then I started, the next task was to develop a business decision model. I put together different layers of this, starting with the top layer, Porter's value chain. A firm has information systems capabilities for new business opportunities. That's his production level strategic themes. Is a company a conglomerate? Are they focused on one business? Are they a service organization? Or do they provide a product? That's at the executive level, chief executive level. And depending upon new business, one of the many system capabilities will be used. This is the execution activity level, the enterprise operations model. It's a book by Jeannie Ross and others from MIT, Center for Information System Research. Their operation model where you operate, whether your systems are integrated or dispersed, centralized or decentralized. And then finally, at the capability enablers, the sourcing decision. How do you execute on these sourcing decisions? Strategic themes. I think it might be better if I go right to the model first, and then I'll come back to these. There's a layer or barrier between each one of these levels. A firm's value chain, product level, strategic themes. What business is the company in? Now, depending upon the business, there's a number of capabilities they have. Probably an extreme example would be General Electric. It's a very large conglomerate. They do everything from nuclear power plants to light bulbs to, well, I guess they sold off their appliance business, but very diversified. So they certainly have a lot of different capabilities. That's the enterprise operation model, the operations, whether you have centralized or decentralized IT. If the businesses are very different, you'd have separate. And then the enabling level, the sourcing decision. And commodity, hardware, software, they went through, that's IT according to Nicholas Carr, or many business believe IT is this chain here. Where we have the sourcing decision is here. Your staff management ability to execute physical plant. That's where you make your service provider decision. You can either have it in-house or ex-house. But the critical, business critical differentiators, the things that must be within house are business relation and marketing priority. That's the core business, is what a business is, business relations. So the top level was Porter's value chain, highest level business strategic themes. Traditionally, the strategic themes have been low cost, differentiating, or uncontested, the blue ocean market space. That's traditionally. I'm adding information systems. Strategic themes are long-term constraints that are decoupled from the underlying execution layers. These different layers, you can decouple or have different sources, but still keep the same strategic theme. Below are products and services is the execution activity level, includes capabilities to execute the firm's value chain. Capabilities at the execution level are governed by the enterprise operation model and provides a strategy of combining based on degree of enterprise business process. The execution level is decoupled from a strategic theme. In the sourcing decision, critical capabilities within an organization need to be kept in-house, internal, and if they're not critical, they could be outsourcing. A common example is payroll. EDP does a very good job processing payroll. A company would not necessarily want to have their own payroll department. Some companies, that could be a differentiator, where particular incentives to sales individuals may be a competitive advantage, so there you may want to have your payroll system in-house. Again, the enabling level is decoupled from the execution level, allowing sourcing to swapped out without impacting capabilities. A company would still have the ability to pay its employees, whether it's insourced or outsourced, so that could be swapped out, but a decision has to be made whether that is, which is appropriate. And the synthesis of all of this starts with the Strategic Capability Network, an IBM patent in 2001. And I've modified this using 3 different models: the value chain model, the enterprise operation model from MIT, and the sourcing decision from the literature. I believe these slides are going to be available. So I've described the model. Now I'm doing a hypothetical application. I'm looking for a company that I can work with on this. I'm bringing in another discipline, operational research, to try to find an application for this decision model, where the dollar value is estimated at the execution level, at the enterprise operation model level, and cost and constraints of IT capability enablers is a sourcing decision model. Microsoft Excel has linear programming. That is, everyone has on a desktop. I don't know why we don't use these tools more often. But I just developed a hypothetical. I'm trying to find a real-world case in which the company would allow this to be published. But to just put an idea that we can source and actually put a dollar value on which tool you should use, which particularly I'm sourcing the hardware here, whether it's a mainframe, Unix, or Wintel. And then we have constraints for hardware, software, staff, competency, and speed to implementation. How fast can you get an application up and running? And the marketing priority, is it a high priority or low priority? Linear programming will do literally thousands of calculations, different simulations, and come up with the optimum solution. It's not so important that to look at this tool, but to know the tool is available. One of the important things I think architects should understand is there's a lot of tools from a lot of different disciplines available. I'm actually went through several years already, and now kind of reflections. This is something I added for this conference, reflecting on enterprise architecture as an academic discipline. I should probably expand this to business architecture, solution architecture, all of the different 6 groups that are here today. I'm here, I guess, from the Association of Enterprise Architects, the Twin Cities Architectonians, which I've been a member for a number of years. I'm going through the history of the different selected disciplines, academic disciplines. In the 16th century, modern mathematics were developed. 17th century, we had scientific methods. Also in the 17th century, skeptical chemists, distinction between chemistry and alchemy. I say that because I was a chemist for many years, where they actually separated the science from magic happening. I sometimes wonder if in the modern world of technology we don't still have that marketing telling us magic is happening. Maybe we need to be skeptical. First hardware computer, I'm using just an example, UNIVAC 1101. And then 1972, IBM published an article, Information Systems Management Architecture. I think this is one of the first references to architecture as a specific discipline. They're saying it as a subset of information systems management. And Langsford classical definition of information systems in 1973, people, process, technology, or it's information which humans have acted on. Over the large scheme of these 500 years, we can see that computers are relatively new. A framework for information system architecture from Zachman, 1987. Yes, that's quite a few years ago, but in the scheme of things, as an academic discipline or developing this field of architecture, that is really relatively new. A technical architecture framework for information management, later turned over to the Open Group in 1995, presented TOGAF 1.0. 1999 Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework. The point of this is the field of architecture is relatively new. To develop this field, we have two different types. I want to explain the literature a little. We have practitioner publications. Surprisingly, Harvard Business Review is a practitioner. It's not peer-reviewed. There are a lot of books out there, and a book generally is a practitioner where they do present a state-of-the-art, what's currently happening in the field. It's generally accepted by industry, but not the academic community, but it's experiential information or opinion. They'll go to Wikipedia, for instance, and find out a lot of information. Wikipedia is a good source. It's heresy in the academic world, but if you use Wikipedia, there is often a lot of good references. You look at the bottom and you can see the source references, which are certainly a good place to look. But the practitioner publications, there's a lot of books, are generally not peer-reviewed, and they're a point in time. They're not developed over time. Scholarly research builds upon prior research. That's somewhat what I'm trying to present today as I build upon this work on information systems. It provides for peer review in the journals or the presentations. And it's a pathway from seminal research to practical application. The seminal research, I guess we would go to with the original research, Zachman in 1987, leading up to today and beyond. It's often published as papers or presentations and not necessarily a book for publish, because you're building pieces at a time. Hope I'm not jumping around too much, but I wanted to give another example of of an organization and how it's evolved over time. And hopefully architecture as a discipline will evolve over time too. There's another organization in the Twin Cities. I've been active. It's an active organization, AITP, Association of Information Technology Professionals. In the 1950s, there was another organization in the Twin Cities called the Key Punch Supervisors Organization. It's a group that had a very concerned key punch supervising. It's no longer used, obviously, but at the time, key punch supervising was a very concern. And so a group banded together, similar as architects are banding together today. And eventually that was incorporated into the National Machine Accountants Association in 1951 in Chicago, where they had their constitutional convention. You know, maybe this convention could be the constitutional convention for the architects to develop. Over time, essentially back in 1950s, it was accountants. If you think of technology and computers in 1950, one of the main first use of computers in organizations was payroll and accounting systems to keep track of the books. So it made sense that the Accounting Association would be one of the first. 1962, in order to stay current, they adopted the Data Processing Management Association. I was a member of that when not in 1962, but later on. But then again, it evolved to the Association of Information Technology. I'm just presenting this as how an organization will evolve. If this is in fact the constitutional convention of the Midwest Consortium of Architect Collaboration, it would evolve over time, and other organizations have. So the lesson is technical organizations must evolve to stay relevant. And this is my, should be a final slide, but my reflection on information systems architecture as a relatively new discipline. And I'm using the original term IS architecture to include the plethora of subdomains, enterprise business solution architects, etc. I'm just going back to the original seminal work of information system architecture. And practitioner publications document the current state of evolving IS architecture. The open group is, I would call, a practitioner organization where we have practicing architects in the organization. And it is important to integrate with other mature disciplines, such as business, operational research, which I showed you with the linear programming, rather than to isolate as an independent enterprise. To develop everything within the architecture community and not be aware or integrate within business would be a mistake. There's always this challenge, as I mentioned, with Nicholas Carr expressing the opinion that technology is just hardware and software. Architects need to integrate with the business. In fact, IT should become a business. It may eventually become a separate business. It could be outsourced or insourced as a business. Have to be aware of that, use other things like operational research, mathematics. Thank you. Yes?
Locally here, I'm not didn't work for this company, but they outsourced their web presence to Amazon and then have since brought it back in-house. But I think one of the questions I would ask is this, the web presence is what I would call an architectural capability. Is there any way that they could have avoided the problems associated with that? Thinking specifically of, I think Target initially went with Amazon, right?
Right.
So is there anything they could have done to say, well, maybe we should just wait a little while and develop that stuff in-house and not basically give away all this information about our customers?
It goes back to the sourcing decision. Is it critical to their business? If it's critical to their business, the customer list, I would think, is critical. They call data the jewel to the kingdom. It should be kept in-house because you're giving away your business if you give away a critical component. Now,
But speed to market and distribution capability, maybe they thought that. What I was wondering is about the variables you talked about using linear programming and how could they have come up to a different decision? You know what I'm saying? Is it, you know, it feels like that would be a gut decision as opposed to is there a quantitative way to evaluate that was a bad decision, you know, to partner that way.
Okay, I didn't show it, but there is a four-square grid. And in that grid, on one axis, you have, is it business critical or not? You know, to what degree is it business critical? On the other axis, you have, is it a commodity or is it a proprietary? If it is proprietary and a business differentiator, that's going to be in the upper right column, then that's something need to be kept in-house. If it's a commodity, but it's still proprietary, you would do the best sourcing of it. If it's a commodity and not differentiator, it's best to outsource it. So there is that four-square model. I could add that model to this before I publish it here.
I have a question. You mentioned keeping it in-house.
Yes.
And I wonder what you meant by keeping it in-house, because, and the reason I ask the question is there are many cloud-based SaaS integration platforms out there now, which you're keeping your data in-house, but the capability to deliver it and leverage it is not in-house. So I'm just trying to understand what in-house means.
The whole cloud fogs the decision, doesn't it? If it's a presentation layer on the cloud, I think that's fine. If it's the actual machines and the database, there you go again to the sourcing decision. Is it differentiating, proprietary? Then it should be in-house. I'm always, with all the security concerns, I'm always concerned about putting the company assets on the public internet, I guess.
I guess my argument is if the company's on the internet, there's not a lot of difference. Okay.
Yeah. Well, does the company own the web servers, or does the cloud, or does Amazon? Any others? Question?
Does Gartner fall into the practitioner, like the Gartners, the Forresters, the Megas of the world? Are they more practitioners?
Oh, yeah, I was going to describe them more as scholarly because they actually do surveys, research, etc. How much time do I have?
It's 10:23.
10:23. Just very briefly. Gartner's, Forresters, certainly they do their own research, so they are research. It's not necessarily peer-reviewed, but it's not practitioner from the standpoint of they're not presenting just an opinion from working as a consultant. So they do charge for that. Some of the original, this is a PRISM report. It's available on the Association of Enterprise Architecture website. It's the original study, very large study of a lot of different organizations done by CSC, Index, and Champy to develop interconnected approaches to distributed system architecture. It's actually a very large research study, similar to what Gartner or Forrester will do, where they did surveys of many, many companies to find this. It wasn't peer-reviewed in the sense of academic papers, but it certainly is a large, well-done study. Later on, this was taken by Champy and Hammer. They published the book Re-Engineering the Architects, Re-Engineering the Corporation in the 1990s, which a whole stream of re-engineering processes took place in the 1990s. And later, James Champy went on to be the president of Computer Science Corporation Consulting Group, and they developed a whole methodology around this. So this is, I think, well-based, an example of the Gartner or Forrester type research. And I bring this PRISM report up because it's one of the first studies, or this would be kind of seminal architecture. Let's see. It's too much to go through in 3 minutes. It's available on the Association of Enterprise Architecture site. With that, thank you for the opportunity to come here.